All right, hello everyone. We've been talking about climate solutions all week. We've been talking about everything from clean energy to natural solutions to forests to the ocean. And today I want to zoom way out and talk about geopolitics and the energy transition. There's no one more expert on this topic than Jason Bordoff, the founding director of the Columbia University's Center for Global Energy Policy. And so I want to start with the energy transition. How is the energy transition impacting geopolitics?
Well, first, thanks, Greg and Dan and the whole team at Aspen for having me this year and the collaboration we have over the course of the year. You've run a phenomenal team at the Aspen Institute, and we're really lucky at Columbia to collaborate with Greg and his team on many things around energy and climate. I really enjoyed Jake's talk, and I think some of the comments I would make would build on it in two respects. One, he and I went to middle school together and haven't seen each other since. And I think if you want to think about things that give you hope, these careers have come full circle now where we're both spending each and every day trying to think about how to solve the climate crisis from totally different perspectives. And what I just saw is phenomenal in what he has spent his career doing. He made a comment about the early adopters, the people who get this problem, the people who are probably in this room right now, and how to bring more people along by helping them understand the severity of the impacts of climate, of extreme weather. I come at that problem from a slightly different standpoint because my background is in foreign policy and national security and geopolitics. And when we think about the urgency of accelerating a clean energy transition, it is certainly because of the impacts of climate change that we are already seeing and are going to see. It is also because you can build a broader coalition. You can build interest in this when you think about the energy crisis we saw over the last several years, driven by Russia's weaponization of natural gas, and a reminder that as you are dependent on globally traded hydrocarbons, inevitably exposed to geopolitical risk, there is messiness to the transition. We can talk about that, but in the long run, a decarbonized energy system is going to be a more energy secure one as well as a cleaner one. We right now are seeing, to the extent there can be agreement across the aisle, which is difficult on these issues, some of the things that start to build it are thinking about the enormous economic opportunities that are created by the transition, the national security, the concerns that can come because of competition, particularly in an era of deteriorating relations between the great powers, US and Europe on the one hand and China on the other. There are a host of national security reasons, geostrategic and geoeconomic reasons to accelerate this transition. That's not happening today, to your question, at anywhere near the scale and speed it needs to. And so we're in this moment now of both hope and concern. When you look at, over the last 10 years, by any measure, where we are, 1 in 5 cars sold this year globally will be electric. That's compared to 1 in 20 just a few years ago. Globally, nearly twice as much spent last year on clean energy as spent on fossil fuels. You can sort of go down this list of numbers that are extraordinary with how quickly clean energy is growing. And the only problem is oil use is going up, and gas use is going up, and coal use is going up, and emissions are going up. So two things can both be true at the same time, and we can talk about why that is. And right now, we're in an era that I worry a little bit about, which is we're in an era of war and conflict globally that sap attention and resources from the transition. We're in an era of this great power competition that can, if not managed, slow the pace of clean energy adoption. We're in an era of populism and right-wing parties on the rise around the world in a year where half the global population is going to vote in elections. So some of the worrisome geopolitical trends we're seeing are complicating the energy transition. And if we're not careful about how we go about this clean energy transition, a messy, disorderly transition can worsen some of those same geopolitical forces. And that is a downward spiral that we have to be conscious of and reverse, because it is reversible.
And on that downward spiral, geopolitics impacting the energy transition impacting geopolitics. How do we get out of that tailspin, and how do we, reverse it and be able to get those two things to have a positive correlation with each other?
Yeah, I think the first way is to identify what challenges we're trying to address. And so again, right now you see the rise of populism, you see economic fragmentation globally, you see a pushback to the perceived or real costs of the transition. In the United States, 38% of people surveyed said that they would pay $1 per month for climate change, whatever we define that. That number is down 14 percentage points from 2021. In an era of rising inflation and economic concerns, the political support for stronger climate action, sometimes clean energy is cheaper, but not always. There is a cost. It's lower than the cost of not having a transition and suffering the impacts of climate. So we need to identify what some of those geopolitical challenges are today. And then as we think about the way in which we're going about this transition, a major motivating force for, say, the Inflation Reduction Act, we just heard about, a historic piece of climate legislation with so much opportunity. It is not just climate action, it's industrial policy. It is an effort to build a stronger domestic economy, to create jobs and manufacturing in the United States, and in order to qualify for the tax credits Jake was talking about, much of the manufacturing activity and the economic activity has to be done either in the United States or in free trade partners or in neighboring countries. There's a lot of potential benefit to that. There are risks too, because you can't have a clean energy transition at the scale and speed we need without integrated global markets, without comparative advantage, without parts of the world are going to be better at making some things than others. And it is probably correct to maybe not think about China quite the same way we did 30 years ago in the formation of the WTO. But it is also the case that you need to, you can't have every country try to make the clean energy transition happen within its own borders. And what we're actually seeing today are countries that can't compete with $1 trillion in subsidies, that are worried they'll lose investment, and they're putting up roadblocks, they're putting up tariffs, they're putting up barriers. So Indonesia says we're going to ban the export of raw nickel. Maybe we'll ban the export of refined and processed nickel because we want the battery manufacturing to all happen here. But if every country sets up trade barriers and restrictions that require everything to be done within their borders, you're going to raise the cost of the transition and slow it down. So what we need to do is find a way to think about, the US and Europe are talking about a climate club, cooperation on things like green steel and aluminum that might raise the bar and encourage others to join while remaining committed to some form of global economic integration. We're going to need somewhere between, according to the International Energy Agency, $1.5 to $2 trillion by 2030 into the clean energy transition in emerging and developing economies, compared to $250 billion this year. I mean, just several-fold more in parts of the world where there are a lot of challenges to putting capital to work. We need to overcome those in ways that benefit those local economies. Don't just go and extract critical mineral resources to bring halfway around the world for refining and processing, but simultaneously might think about the enormous economic opportunities that'll be created for US firms, for the technologies, the services that could be needed by export. In the same way that, the Marshall Plan, right? Like after World War II was not purely about charity and altruism, it was about rebuilding Europe economically because it was in the geostrategic and geoeconomic interest of the United States to have a strong and healthy European economy. There are opportunities to do the same, particularly in the emerging and developing economies where we need much, much more capital invested in the clean energy economy. And there are just huge barriers to putting that to work. And again, what we're seeing now is things going in the other direction. You saw this you've been at the climate meetings in Dubai and Sharm el-Sheikh, rising, not reduced tensions between between developed and developing countries over a sense of unfairness, a sense of hypocrisy and resentment for how this clean energy transition is unfolding, because some parts of the world are at risk of being left behind.
So you go to a lot of climate conferences and energy conferences, but you also go to a lot of national security conferences. And when you go to places like the Munich Security Forum, are there climate people that are involved in those conversations? And are the people working on national security and international security around the world, are they thinking about the physical impacts of climate change and how that's going to impact national security and international security?
Somewhat, but not enough. It's a major focus of what we do at the the Center on Global Energy Policy and the Institute of Global Politics that our dean at the School of International Public Affairs at Columbia and Secretary Hillary Clinton created recently. And we have a joint initiative on the geopolitics of climate change and the energy transition, precisely to try to bring these communities together. We, for all the reasons I talked about, and we could talk much more about it obviously, making sure that the urgency, the opportunities, the messiness, the potential geopolitical complications, as well as the risks of the physical impacts of climate change themselves. A melting Arctic and what that might mean for military competition between the US and China and other great powers, competition for resources. You see it around the world today with drought, then flooding in the Himalayas, and cooperation historically to some extent between India and Pakistan breaking down. You see it impacting energy security, where historic low water levels are complicating passage through the Panama Canal for shipping at the same time that nobody wants to ship things through the Red Sea because of conflict with the Houthis is having significant economic impacts. In the Mekong Delta, where Chinese dams are creating downstream water risks, competition rather than cooperation for resources. So I think the conversation is broadly understood that climate change is going to mean more migration, more refugees, more conflict over water, but it's still superficial, it's still seen as too far off. And understandable if you're in the Situation Room every day and you're thinking about national security with Israel and Gaza and Russia and Ukraine, and we got a ton of problems every morning on the list of things to focus on. But I do think it's important that national security leaders understand climate change to be a more pressing, more today, more urgent issue than is the case today. And conversely, settings like this one, or the climate meeting in Dubai, or something else, I appreciate the invitation to be here as someone who thinks about foreign policy, and I think we need more of that as well.
So one of the themes that we have been hearing about this week that sort of bubbled up to the top is, what if we get this right? And so from your perspective, what does the year 2050 look like if we do the right things in the energy transition, if we do the right things geopolitically? What does that look like in the future, that envisioned future?
It's, well, certainly one where emissions are, if not net zero, a small fraction of what they are today. It is, as I said in the beginning, there are energy security risks to this transition, whether it is a mismatch between the decline in oil supply and the decline in oil demand that lead to tight markets, and you might strengthen the hand of geopolitical actors like Saudi or Qatar before in the long run it's diminished. There could be new risks from clean energy sources, particularly, say, critical minerals, where, as people may know, 80–90% of most minerals are refined and processed in China. That's about the multi-decade process of transition. Like getting from here to there is going to be difficult and complicated. We often think about the end state. What does net zero look like? Hopefully we get close to that or all the way there. And when we get there, I think it is a world, as I said earlier, that is more energy secure. A lot of energy security risks today come from global trade. A decarbonized world, we know, will be one that is much more electrified. Electricity tends to be produced and consumed more locally. According to the International Energy Agency, global energy-related trade is around 40% of what it is today in a world that gets to net zero. So that has energy security benefits that can reduce the potential for geopolitical conflict. And hopefully it's one where there is cooperation. It doesn't matter where, for example, we know we need a lot of renewable energy. We know that we probably need some amount of negative emissions. And you can think about technology that might remove, say, CO2 from the air. It doesn't matter where that happens. Any ton of CO2 removed contributes equally. Right now, I recently visited a plant in Iceland. And why Iceland? Because they have really cheap renewable energy, geothermal, and they have really good geologic storage capacity. You know where else has that? Is the Rift Valley in Kenya. So what if countries that are wealthier and had historically contributed the bulk of the emissions thought about where to deploy some of these technologies globally that improved cooperation between rich and poor countries, created economic opportunities in parts of the world that historically have been targets of investment for extraction? We can think about being targets of investment for clean energy solutions. Another example might be this low carbon hydrogen, whether it's green hydrogen or maybe even geologic, naturally occurring hydrogen. We'll see if that works. It won't necessarily make sense to produce that, say, in North Africa, where there's a lot of low-cost solar, and ship hydrogen as ammonia halfway around the world to be used to make steel somewhere else. You might just move the steel making to where the low-cost hydrogen is. Again, creating economic opportunities for parts of the world that don't have it today. That would be an optimistic version. But there are pessimistic ones too, and I worry that in some respects we may be headed for some of those today if we don't pay attention to it.
So last question. I'm from New Jersey, and I understand that
So is my wife.
And I understand you're a big Bruce Springsteen fan.
He's from New Jersey.
He is from New Jersey. If the energy transition were Bruce Springsteen lyrics, what would they be?
That's such a challenging question. He has a song, Waiting on a Sunny Day, which I guess is what we need to do to balance the intermittency with renewables. But there's I think, a lyric, or not the chorus, a lyric in Badlands. You spend your life waiting for a moment that just won't come. Well, don't spend your time waiting. So that's sort of what we all need to do when we think about what it takes to accelerate this transition, is kind of just get on it and get our hands dirty and pick up whatever piece we can contribute to. Don't spend our time waiting, just try to make it happen.
So everyone needs to leave here today and go make it happen, and thank you, Jason.
Thank you.